We're going to start with Nicole Eustace. Nicole, back at me here. She'll read from Covered with Night, a story of murder and indigenous justice in early America, which, along with the 2022 Pulitzer Prize, was also a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for Nonfiction. Pretty impressive. Nicole is a professor of American history at New York University, and she lives in Mamaroneck, New York. I'm a New Yorker, but I can't say it. Mamaroneck, New York, with her two sons and her husband, Jay, who are in the audience. We welcome you to Brattleboro, folks. Her unique and exquisite narrative uses the 1722 murder of an indigenous leader and voices of an indigenous diplomat named Captain Civility to vividly depict the clash of cultures between early colonists and the indigenous peoples they ultimately consumed. It is a forgotten story that sheds light on the vast philosophical gulf between the two, a gulf we are still reckoning with today. The Society of American Historians gave Nicole the Francis Parkman Prize for the book's literary elegance as well as its historical importance. So Nicole will now read. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Sandy Rouse and the Brattleboro Literary Festival for having me, and thank you to a long-lost friend who I see in the audience. I know about Brattleboro for a long time because one of my close friends from high school was originally from Brattleboro before moving to New York, and they're a really special group, and we loved just anything creative. So I feel that's very formative for me, and it's very moving to be back here. This book was just a labor of love. I am a professor, and I wrote 2 monographs, first to get tenure and then to get promoted. And I really enjoyed the analytical work in those books, but I always had a yen to do some storytelling. And this was my, okay, I can do whatever I want book. And I never kind of expected for it to land, with as big a splash as it ultimately did. It's a small story. It's the story of the murder of one indigenous hunter by a pair of colonial fur traders. A Seneca man named Sawantini was a well-recognized fur trader in the Susquehanna Valley. And John and Edmund Hartledge were 2 Pennsylvania colonial brothers. John Hartledge was actually a justice of the peace, in addition to being someone who made money in the fur trade in really kind of any way that he could. He raised horses and had a farm and had a trading post and had a tavern, and like many colonial, did it all. And John and Edmund marched off one day to bargain with Sawantini for a cache of furs. They were sitting around a campfire on a cold February night and bargaining. John was known for running rum. He had been cited many times, brought to court many times for running rum. And the Haudenosaunee, which at that point were 5 nations, they were soon to become 6, but the Haudenosaunee were the most important indigenous power in the region, and they had requested a treaty with the colonists of Pennsylvania to stop selling rum just the summer before, and John Cartledge had been the person who provided translation services at that treaty. None of this stopped John from riding up to Sawantini's cabin, which he shared with his wife, a woman named Winnie P. Wada, who was Shawnee, and trying to use rum to force through a very unequal bargain. Well, Sawantini resisted. They got into an argument, and the 2 brothers, John and Edmund, brutally assaulted Sawantini, beat him to within an inch of his life, and rode off. Away with it. They did not, because word spread quickly. First, a delegation of Native people went to colonial Maryland, because where someone murdered was right in a kind of a nebulous area that colonies hadn't even surveyed. No one really knew what the claimed boundaries were. So they went to Maryland authorities, a delegation of Native people from various nations that were all living in the same area. And they had a surprising request. They asked for reparations. They did not ask for vengeance.
they asked for reparations. The Maryland authorities were quite surprised by this. The Maryland authorities put in writing that they were terrified this was going to create a war. When the Philadelphia authorities, who actually had claimed jurisdiction over the Cartledge brothers, found out about the murder, they too thought this was going to create a war. So I thought that I would read you 3 short excerpts that kind of describe the actual Indigenous reaction to the murder, because what the book tries to explore are the very different approaches to justice between the English settler colonists and the Indigenous peoples of the region, with English common law calling for the arrest of the suspects, they're being jailed while held for trial, they're being tried for their lives and potentially subjected to capital punishment. Native people, as I've said, had a very different idea. They actually wanted, first and foremost, for the colonists to express condolences. The title of the book is Covered with Night, and that's a Haudenosaunee metaphor for grief. When you are in grief, when you are in mourning, you're covered with night, you're wrapped in darkness. That's the full phrase. And so the first thing that they wanted was an expression of a formal expression of condolence. They wanted one from the Cartledge brothers as individuals. They wanted one from the settler colonists as a community. Their approach to resolving a crisis of violence was very much a communal one. It wasn't about identifying an individual perpetrator and then subjecting that perpetrator to a harsh punishment. It was about noticing that this created a rupture in communal ties. So that meant they wanted condolences from the Cartledges, but also from the settler colonists. They wanted the colonists to participate in formal rituals of repair, condolence ceremonies that had this emotional component of sharing grief, and also a spiritual component of trying to come back into communion together. They wanted the presentation of ritual objects like wampum, and they wanted reparations. They wanted substantial payments of trade goods to recompense the Sawantanis community for his loss. Once all of those steps were taken, emotional, spiritual, material forms of restitution, they did not want to see further impact on the lives of the perpetrators. So the first little excerpt that I'm going to read you, if I can. Haha, I just am turning 50 and my eyes went 5 minutes ago. Yeah, all right, I think I can do this. I don't have the large print edition, I should. All right, so the first excerpt that I'm going to read you describes a Cayuga man his name was Sachichoa. He was a go-between who lived in the same region that the Cartledges and the murdered man Sawantani did, but who had ties with the Five Nations outside Albany. So he had gone to consult with leaders of the Five Nations outside Albany. Okay, so here we go. Mondays, the streets outside the Philadelphia courthouse are noisier than ever. On that day of the week, the city sheriff takes to the shade of the courthouse to hold public auctions of property seized by law. Readers of this week's American Weekly Mercury, the colony's first newspaper, are already anticipating the, quote, public vendue advertised for next Monday at the courthouse, where they will have the chance to try for a nice price on, quote, a very good Negro woman and her child, or perhaps to purchase, quote, a boy about 2 years old and a mulatto boy about 9 years of age. Their former masters have surrendered them to the sheriff for the satisfaction of debts. The erstwhile owners regard these human sales as preferable to the alternative of an extended stay in debtor's prison for themselves. And eager crowds will gather as the sheriff barks to gawk at the shackled toddler and the others, even if they can't afford to bid. On this Monday morning, the 30th of July, after pushing his way through the throngs outside, the colony's official secretary, James Logan, dips his plume in ink and records the names of a dozen men and a single woman present for what he describes as, quote, a public audience appointed by the governor. The men in attendance, besides the governor, include 4 recently arrived Indians, as well as 4 Quaker and 4 Anglican members of the council. Almost immediately, oh no, sorry, I skipped ahead, but I think that won't work. Okay. This religious balance, the 4 and 4, means that Keith can be confident he won't be outnumbered in the midst of this crucial meeting. The Indians include Sachichoa, who I've just told you about, the Cayuga man, and another man, Taquataran Sali. The Soul Woman is a ferry keeper. Logan explains her presence by noting that Taquataran Sali will interpret from the Mingo into the Delaware Indian tongue. The ferry keeper, named Alice Kirk, will translate from that into English. Logan must transcribe quickly as Sachichoa begins to speak. Almost immediately, the assembled Pennsylvania colonists can sense something wrong. Sachichoa addresses them without first presenting any gifts of wampum. He offers no intricately beaded belt of delicately drilled pieces of purple and white clamshell, not even a more ordinary string of beads threaded into a simple chain. Normally, Indian diplomats preface their official statements by offering ritual tokens of respect such as these, the better to signal the seriousness and sincerity of their communications. But Sachichoa is plunging in without preamble. In omitting formalities, Sachichoa offers the Pennsylvanians a deliberate slight. If they listen carefully, they'll hear the explanation in his opening remarks. He tells them that although he did succeed in meeting the leaders of the Five Nations to discuss the apparent death of his friend Sawantini, quote, the chiefs had not time to meet and open the presents sent to them by the governor. Letting this sink in, he then adds that over the summer they had been too busy getting, quote, victuals of fish out of the rivers and some venison from the woods to bother much about the diplomatic offerings from Pennsylvania. Instead, they set them aside to be opened along with gifts from governors of other British colonies. Sachichoa explains to the governor and council that he succeeded in arranging a meeting only with a leader of the Cayugas, one of the Five Nations. The other leaders claimed to be too busy to meet with him. At this, Sachichoa advances a request. The governors of Virginia and New York are planning to arrive in Albany to negotiate with the Five Nations next month, he says, and they desire that the governor and James Logan, his secretary, will also come. Amongst the Haudenosaunee, people in grief are considered to be covered with night. Assuaging the community's sadness requires an in-person visit to redress the wrong. Yet if Governor Keith thinks that the path out of Pennsylvania's predicament requires sacrificing the cartilages on the altar of English justice, Sachichoa has more news for him. The Indians do not want to follow English precedents. They most definitely do not want the cartilages to be executed. Sachichoa tells the gathering that one Cayuga leader with whom he was able to speak is, quote, of course sorry for the death of the Indian that was killed, for he was his own flesh and blood. But Sachichoa adds a significant twist. According to Alice Kirk's translation from Taquataran Sali's gloss, quote, he desires that John Cartledge may not be put to death for it. Both brothers were implicated in the crime, but it seems the Indians of the Five Nations focused most closely on John. Addressing the broader point of principle, Sachichoa explains, quote, one life is enough to be lost. There should not two die. With these words, Sachichoa does more than just denounce the Haudenosaunee position on this particular case. He is articulating a broader worldview, wholly at odds with English expectations. Emotion figures centrally in the Iroquois approach to justice. The sadness of the mourners, the remorse of the killers, the sympathies of the all create the atmosphere necessary for successfully covering the dead by providing the grief-stricken with offerings of reparations. At the same time, the Haudenosaunee believe it is essential to avoid anger if further violence is to be prevented. Can be forgiven and reintegrated into the community as long as the emotional and material suffering that they cause has been thoroughly redressed. Sachichoa is delivering an eyebrow-raising performance. His listeners on the governing council cannot have anticipated receiving Indian instruction on moral values. In this week's issue of the American Weekly Mercury, they can read a long news item about Indians who, quote, most barbarously murdered colonists in New England. According to the story, survivors saw, quote, Indians coming firing through the woods after them and heard them yell and yowl in a most hideous manner. The report explains that the only reason a second wave of colonists escaped sharing the fate of the murdered ones was because they took warning from the, quote, uncommon mirth of the victors, correctly guessing, quote, by their behavior and manner of dancing and rejoicing that the Indians had, quote, shed blood. Colonists describe newspaper Indians as people akin to animals, yowling creatures who delight in bloodshed. How then can the flesh and blood Indian, Sachi Choa, now appearing before the council, be lecturing the governor on avoiding anger and urging him against the mistake of taking life in response to death? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, so much for that reading. I want to now introduce Julian Sancton. His New York Times bestseller, Madhouse at the End of the Earth, The Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night, is a gripping Hitchcockian, true survival story of a 3-year polar expedition that began in 1897, where the Belgica was purposefully driven into a situation where the ship got frozen in ice with the crew trapped inside for a freezing, sunless winter. And the book records very faithfully what ensued, which is just incredibly gripping. The New York Review of Books called it a vivid horror story, thrillingly recounted. Julian is an editor at The Hollywood Reporter and has edited at Vanity Fair, Esquire, and Departures. And he's written for such publications as The New Yorker, Wired, and Playboy. And he wrote a piece about a foie gras-obsessed chef for Playboy that was chosen for a celebrated anthology on food writing. So Julian has a lot of breadth as a journalist. He's reported from every continent, including Antarctica, where he first visited while researching this book. I should add the book has incredible photographs, and the photographs on the website are also just amazing. Julian grew up outside Paris and received a degree in history from Harvard College, and he lives in Larchmont, New York, with his partner Jessica and his 2 daughters, who we are also so pleased to have with us here today. So without further ado, Julian.
Thank you very much, Lissa, and thanks to the Brattleboro Literary Festival and Sandy for having me here. This is a town I've come through many times, but never stopped at. On our way to a frozen lake every winter to try to. This is a tradition among friends of mine in Lake Sunapee, up in New Hampshire, and that's where I first got a taste for the cold. We would camp out on the ice, and that I guess prepared me for writing this Antarctic adventure. But the first I heard of the Belgica expedition was about 7 years ago. I was at my desk at Departures magazine, flipping through a copy of the New Yorker, which is a magazine I far preferred, and at the time, and I ran across an article by a great journalist named Tom Kizia about NASA's preparations for manned missions to Mars. And it began unexpectedly in classic New Yorker fashion by kind of backing into the story with a description of the first expedition of the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration, which is the aforementioned Belgica expedition. And I was intrigued how an article about space travel could begin there and why. It turns out that NASA studies, since there's very few analogs for Martian travel, the closest there is on Earth in our historical record is these expeditions to the most hostile environment on Earth, which was Antarctica, the last, I guess, great geographical mystery the last continent to be discovered. It wasn't known until a few years after the Belgica expedition that it even was a continent, as opposed to a vast ocean of ice. And so this article just summarized what had been written about the Belgica expedition before, which was very little, but it left from Antwerp, Belgium. It was led by a plucky young Belgian naval commander named Adrien de Gerlache, and he assembled it was definitely under-budgeted, poorly staffed, I guess inadequately planned, but full of men with thirst for adventure and glory and high hopes, and they probably wouldn't have left if they knew what was in store for them. They certainly underestimated the power of the Antarctic continent. Among them were, as I mentioned, the commander, Adrien de Gerlache, this aristocratic Belgian sailor who had refused to participate in the colonization of the Congo. The king had asked him to help chart the river system of the Congo, which would have put him in the same waters as Kurtz and Marlowe in Heart of Darkness. But he had his eye on colder horizons and figured that he would be the first to answer the great call of all the geographical societies of the Western world at that time, to finally elucidate this great geographical mystery and find out what lay at the bottom of the world maps. So he was one of my three main characters. The other two were a man that would come to be known as perhaps the greatest polar explorer who ever lived, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who ended up discovering, or rather being the first to reach the South Pole later on in 1912. And then the third, and I can't hide my affection for this character. He is the surgeon on board, was the sole American on board, named Frederick Cook, who, if anybody remembers him today, probably remembers him for the inglorious second half of his career, when he became known as a con man, was found out to have lied about being the first to reach the North Pole after having celebrated around the world for that falsified accomplishment, and then ended up running a Ponzi scheme and being convicted to 14 years, sentenced to 14 years in Leavenworth prison. So, but I make the argument in this book that his, I guess, very vivid imagination and his con man qualities were used to beneficial effect in here and helped keep his shipmates alive. Not everyone, but certainly helped ensure that some of the men would return to write about the expedition. I want to read a passage first about the first casualty of the expedition, which was, well, I won't reveal because it'll be clear enough who it is. The characters here, there's the main character I'll focus on here is a deckhand named Carl August Vinke, who was a Norwegian deckhand. He had just celebrated his 20th birthday, beloved by all on board, very bright young man, but who had a problem heeding to safety precautions, let's say. Carl August Vinke was at the helm shortly before noon on January 22nd, when sudden gale-force winds blew the sea into a frenzy. Penguins, I should add that they haven't yet seen the Antarctic continent. They're about to make their first glimpse of it. Penguins bounded in and out of the chop. Adjusting the wheel constantly for the yaw, pitch, and roll, Vinke did his best to keep the ship steady and on tack and to dodge oncoming icebergs. He was new to the job. Hired as a cabin boy, the 20-year-old Norwegian had been promoted to sailor in Punta Arenas in recognition of his zeal and good cheer after the 4 unruly Belgians were dismissed. Vinke had grown attuned to the music of tempests, the way the winds, quote, seemed to want to tear everything apart and screeched at the rigging with the highest treble right down to the deepest bass. He came alive in such storms, which reminded him of Beethoven's sonatas. Beloved by crew and officers alike, Vinke had proven worthy of his leader's faith. He volunteered for the most dangerous tasks, eager to show off his agility and all too often ignoring Amundsen's pleas for caution. Now he faced his most difficult challenge yet. Icebergs threatened to assail the ship from every direction. It began to snow, further limiting visibility. Sheets of spray slammed into Vinca's yellow sou'wester and oilskin coat. Enormous waves broke over the Belgica amidships and flooded into the hold through the open main hatch. Vinca heard Amundsen's voice slicing through the noise of the wind, calling him down from the bridge to help. After handing off the wheel to the Belgian sailor, Gustave Dufour, Vinca descended the ladder and splashed into the knee-deep water that now inundated the deck. Loose chunks of coal had blocked the scuppers and prevented seawater from escaping. As the ship rocked, the water sloshed from one side of the deck to the other. The pool grew deeper with every wave that crashed over the railings. Vinca ran to Amundsen's side, struggling to keep his footing. The first mate ordered Vinca to help his comrade Johansen unclog one of the scuppers. Various crew members had been jabbing at it with a wooden peg and had succeeded only in packing the coal more tightly. The two would have to get creative. Johansen believed they had no choice but to go at the clog from the outside of the ship. He found a long iron rod to which he lashed a wooden peg to create a mallet they could use to dislodge the coal. Vinca would lie on the gunwale, hold the makeshift mallet over the railing, and align the peg with the scupper while Johansen, securely attached, would lean over the side of the ship and hammer at the peg. Vinca lay down across the wet gunwale in his slick yellow oilskin, gripping the railing with one hand. He held the mallet, and Johansen swung a large hammer at it, over and over, but the mast didn't budge. Johansen stepped away from the railing to think about what to try next. He turned his back to Vinca. An iceberg appeared out of the dense fog ahead of the ship, just meters away. As the Belgica swerved to starboard to avoid it, the wind caught her sails, causing the ship to jolt ahead. Simultaneously, another gargantuan wave smothered the ship. When Johansen turned around, Vinca was gone. Johansen jumped up on the railing and looked below. Nothing. Then he looked astern and caught a terrifying sight, his friend flailing in the frigid water, receding quickly. Johansen ran to the officers' quarters, swung the doors open, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Vinca overboard! Vinca overboard!" At Johansen's cry, de Gerlache and Lecointe, who was the ship's captain, rushed out to the decks. "Quickly, the oil bags!" shouted de Gerlache. Johansen scampered up to the bridge and instructed Dufour to steer into the wind in order to slow the ship down, but the Belgian helmsman shot him a quizzical look and turned his attention back to the onslaught of icebergs. For the first time, the language barrier aboard the Belgica had life-or-death consequences. Johansen resorted to hand signals, but Dufour still didn't understand. With every wasted moment, Vinca fell farther behind the ship. Even in calm waters at this latitude, a man could die of hypothermia within minutes. In a storm, when the risk of drowning was just as high, he would have even less time to get back aboard before the consequences were irreversible. Without a moment to spare, de Gerlache scrambled onto the bridge. He shouldered Dufour aside, took hold of the helm, and hove to, all while keeping an eye on a looming iceberg. Amundsen telegraphed the machinists to throw the engine in reverse. The log line, the thick knotted cord that trailed behind the ship to measure its speed, slithered past Vinca. He swam frantically to grab its end and twisted it around his wrist. The momentum of the ship yanked him forward. Cook gripped the deck end of the line and began steadily to reel him in, fighting against the sea. He dragged Vinca through the waves, each one causing the boy's weight to jerk the log line like a 200-pound fish struggling to swim free. Cook's arms and back quivered. The rope dug into the flesh of his palms. Soon it began to slacken a little. The doctor could feel the sailor's hands slipping. Johansen came to Cook's aid. By the time he arrived at the side of the boat, Vinca could barely stay afloat. Amundsen urged Lecointe and de Gerlache to lower a lifeboat, his voice straining above the roar of the tempest, but the commandant, that's de Gerlache, deemed the storm far too powerful and refused to risk the lives of 4 or 5 sailors to save one. Lecointe volunteered to go in himself. He quickly tied a rope around his waist in a bowline knot and asked de Gerlache's permission to jump. In the moment, as the salt spray needled his face, de Gerlache hesitated. He couldn't abandon Vinca, yet he couldn't afford to lose his second-in-command, whose navigational expertise was irreplaceable. Lecointe took the commandant's perplexed silence for a yes. In an act of unfathomable courage, he stepped onto the gunwale, timed his jump to the ship's swing, and threw himself into the sea. The screaming of the wind and the shouts of his shipmates were muffled in the instant Lecointe plunged underwater. He could hear only the swirl of the ocean. His boots and clothes dragged him down and slowed his rise to the surface. The sea was barely 28.4 degrees, the freezing point of salt water. At that temperature, the dominant sensation isn't cold, but a burning pain. Lecointe surfaced next to Vinca and gasped for air. The younger sailor's eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. He was paralyzed by the cold, but breathing hard through his nose, expelling seawater. Lecointe wrapped his arms around Vinca. Several men tried to hoist them back aboard. The captain had been in the water for just a few seconds, but he could already feel his own muscles seizing up. Tremendous waves lifted Lecointe and Vinca almost to the Belgica's gunwales before dropping them at the end of the rope as if they had been hung from a gallows. Each time the rope snapped taut, Lecointe's hold on Vinca loosened a little more. Vinca was dead weight, and his waterlogged clothing made him even heavier. The rope flicked them 2 or 3 more times before Lecointe let go. Lecointe dangled helplessly. Below him, the log line uncoiled itself from Vinca's wrist, in which it had left deep, discolored furrows. The Belgica rolled so widely that now Vinca came within reach of the deck, and with each wave, came within reach of the deck with each wave. Johansen leaned over the railing, and with Danko and Amundsen holding him back, he was able to grab Vinca's left hand. But as soon as the ship swung away to port, Vinca's unbuoyed weight became too great to bear. Johansen's grip on his friend's limp, wet hand weakened. When the Belgica rocked back to starboard and slammed into the water, Johansen lost his hold. The sea fell away and took Vinca with it. Vinca was now floating on his back. The men finally got a clear look at him. They were met with a ghastly sight. The young man they knew was no longer recognizable. His face was black and swollen, and he was foaming at the mouth. A wave washed Vinca farther away from the ship, and he began to sink. His companions watched from the deck until they could no longer see the yellow of his hat. And I realized I probably shouldn't have read that in front of my children.
Okay, could you pull your chairs up a little more so we make sure you're in the light? We're going to take questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, we can begin. The person in the back, and I'll repeat your question for the camera.
I'm just wondering, when you're writing something that is nonfiction and you're doing all this research, how do you find that balance so that you're telling a really good story, but also making sure that you're being sort of accurate to the historical record and weaving those things together? I think that must be a real huge challenge for you.
Yeah, that was a question I had too, because you both use sort of different narrative styles to really bring the story alive. So I'm curious too. Who wants to go first?
It's definitely a struggle because, as a real historian, I'm an amateur here, but as a real historian can tell you, there is such a multiplicity of points of view on any event, and when you're writing this kind of narrative, you are striving to have one story, one sort of arc, one through line, and you're going to have to inevitably try to incorporate every voice, but sometimes they conflict, and so it's when trying to write something novelistically, I think it should be distinguished from academic history. You're gonna at some point take the side of the. You're going to try to tell the story always as truthfully as you can, but you are going to pick one side in a conflicting viewpoint inevitably. So I guess that kind of streamlining does help propel the narrative. Although I would always say that a book like this should, for somebody who's very interested, should also be accompanied with sort of academic research if you want to get the whole story. This is one person's best effort at telling one version of the truth. But other than that, there's to add details like I did here. For example, the sensation of the cold. That's something that I was not going to invent. And it was not written, it was not described by Lecointe when he fell in the water, what the cold water felt like. I happened to go to Antarctica and jump in the water to figure out what that felt like. And that burning pain was mine. So that's, that experience of going there helped fill in some blanks, helped me describe the continent, for example, and I didn't have to rely on the primary sources because I was that primary source. Other than that, the writing of the men who were aboard, the 17 men who ended up making it to Antarctica because a few were actually kicked off for trying to start a mutiny. So the ones who actually arrived, of those men, almost a dozen kept some kind of record, and they wrote in a novelistic fashion themselves. They were influenced seemingly by Edgar Allan Poe and Jules Verne, and the sort of Gothic tone of the book is not one that I invented. It's one that comes in large part from the men themselves. They were really influenced by literature, so there is a literary feel that comes from that.
So fun and interesting to hear people's process. I like what you said about the sensation of cold wasn't described. And if you think about it, as he was reading, it shifted from describing the specific perceptions of the characters to, this is how you feel at this temperature. This temperature feels like this. And he didn't say that the captain felt like this. He said, this is how it feels. And so that's like it's a little magician's trick. It's a little sleight of hand. I did a lot of that kind of thing myself, and I had to study professional writers to figure out how can I do that, because I am an academic historian. So I get the research part, and there's a lot of scholarship in my footnotes. But to think about, okay, how can I bring in details that are accurate that my exact subjects might not necessarily have? How can I do that gracefully? That's that moment where you very ever so slightly shift into a more universalistic perspective when you've been doing more sort of close third-person narration up to that point. And so that can be kind of a nice touch. I don't think it's the most vivid example in the whole book, but from what I just read to you, when I talk about what was in the newspaper that week, I didn't specifically tell you that I knew the people right there had opened the newspaper. If I had to bet, I would absolutely bet. These are the literate guys. That's what they do. They open the paper. I mean, I can't imagine they didn't read it, but I cannot definitively prove. I don't have a surviving copy of the paper that they autographed and annotated to prove that they read it. So I just mentioned that was published that week. And that's the kind of thing that we do. I will say that, just like in a movie, it could be very strong focus on one main character, or it could be a more ensemble cast. There are different narrative techniques. I actually really was trying for a very multivocal story. And so my chapters of narrative are interspersed with biographical chapters that try to present a really wide range of different native viewpoints and different colonial viewpoints. So there are lots of ways to tell a story.
Other questions? I just want to say that, I noted that you're you call yourself a historian of emotion also, and certainly in both of your books, emotions play an incredibly important role. So I wanted you to comment on that, and also the sort of the characters that you build are so rich, so complex, both of you. Governor Keith and Governor of, Pennsylvania's machinations about getting land. Gerlach's, whole reason for taking the crew into this untenable, probably mortal place. Can you talk a little bit about how you build those emotions and how you come to recognize the emotional qualities of your characters?
Sure. That's actually something that especially for de Gerlache, came in the second draft. The first draft, I guess, was devoid of that, and it took me a while to crack what motivated this man and what the what the stakes were for him. The stakes weren't just survival; they were. I realized that if it's just a survival story, it's certainly gripping, but there was more at stake for him. There was. He was, as I mentioned, a nobleman, or came from an aristocratic family of a very, high society, family, and his family was well known. His ancestor was the first prime minister of the young country of Belgium, which had just seceded from Holland in 1830. And the de Gerlache name was very well known, so he knew that any failure would I guess dishonor his family, and he felt that any failure on his part to achieve the aims that he had set out to, that he got the nation excited about, would end up I guess being a humiliation. And so that's why he was terrified of the press. He was terrified of what people would say about him, more so than he was terrified of the Antarctic, which is why he figured that even though winter was setting in, even though the ice was closing in, and there was no chance for him to reach his objective, which was the South Magnetic Pole that year, that if he had come back without some great achievement, some scientific bounty, some story to tell, then it would have been a great waste of the country's resources and hopes. And so that's why he decided to throw caution to the gale force winds and penetrate as deep into this closing winter ice as he could, because he knew he would come back, maybe not with the southern magnetic pole, maybe not with any tangible resource, but he would come back with a great story to tell if he came back at all. And he figured that was probably the most important thing. So I really, I had to. It took some work to get into his mindset, because it's kind of an insane act to condemn your men to the very real possibility of death, and to something that nobody had ever experienced before, which is a winter in the Antarctic. Nobody knew that was even survivable. Nobody knew what temperatures they would experience. So I figured that there must be some deep psychological reason for this, and so I really endeavored to find that. And I found it through his own writings, through letters, and when you keep the psychology of your main character in mind as a lens, rather than just trying to narrate, trying to chronicle facts, trying to read for little clues to what he was thinking at the time, then I think you just get a much richer story. I think the emotional investment is what keeps people reading just as much, if not more so, than finding out whether they survive or not.
Yeah, thank you. So when I work on the history of emotion, I'm really interested in thinking about emotion and power. So thinking about, what does it mean to claim someone is angry, right? How is that used to put down Native people? What does it mean for Native people to focus on anger as a source of violence and counsel against anger? So when I'm thinking directly about emotion and commenting directly on emotion, it's usually about kind of the social negotiations, the communication of power that comes with using emotion in those kinds of ways. I never, because I'm so conscious of the politics of emotion, I would never say that a character, and I say characters, they're historical figures, right? I would never say that one of my subjects is feeling an emotion just because I'm sort of intuiting that maybe they're feeling it, because they might not themselves express that emotion. And I think there's a lot of strategy every day in what we choose to consciously express. And so I don't want to kind of impute emotions to my people, but of course it's the thing that I'm the most interested in. So what I do is really exactly what you were saying, and that is to think about motivation, to try to really lay out the motivations of my subjects, because I know that you as readers will then put yourself in that person's place, and you'll do that world building. You'll start imagining what you think their emotions are, and you won't notice that I didn't do it for you. It's kind of, again, it's a little piece of the sleight of hand of writing. So in my case, I sort of have three main figures. There's Governor Keith, and he was Sir Keith, Baronet. I had to learn in revision that you never say Sir Keith. You say Sir William, because if you're an aristocrat, you don't need to use your last name when you're using your title. So I had to go back and delete all the Sir Keiths and put in Sir William. So Sir William was an aristocrat from England, and he arrived in the colonies with a very aristocratic view of power. And he was also impoverished. He got a title, but he also got his father's debt. He had no money, so he arrives in Pennsylvania hoping to make some money. So I know that's his big motivation, is trying to kind of recoup his fortunes and create the life for himself to which he literally feels entitled. He is up against some incredibly well-to-do Quaker merchants who have been running the colony for decades and are not particularly interested in this Anglican newcomer who doesn't share their values, and who is incredibly pretentious and yet impoverished. So he is up against his own secretary, James Logan, because the secretary just serves in perpetuity no matter who's the governor. James Logan is really representative of a new way of organizing society, of liberal individualism. He is very much a self-made man. He's incredibly well educated. He has the largest library of any single person in the colonies. And he ultimately, by the end of my book, donates his library to the public. It's the first lending library created in the United States, the kernel of the Library Company of Philadelphia. So he does this thing that advances education and advances democracy, but he's very much about being a liberal individual, maximizing his own profits, whoever he has to enslave, whatever native land he has to take, whatever shady fur trading he needs to do, Logan is going to get ahead. And then the third corner of the triangle is a man named Taquataranzali. That's his name in Susquehannock. Captain Civility, he was known as to colonists. And Captain Civility's role was to try to bring people together in civil society, to try to build community. And Native peoples have principles of community building that are about redistributing resources around the community to try to create kind of emotional connections and economic security for everyone. So you have really these 3 points of a triangle, these very different kind of worldviews and motivations that make for some really interesting clashes.
Absolutely. The triad there is just fascinating, and the role of Captain Civility is and being able to hear his own words. You so deftly use the actual primary source material so well in your book. And I'm just always going to check with the audience if there's a question. Skylar, hi.
I just had a thought about this indigenous notion of reparations, which seems to point directly to the failure of our justice system. The victims of crimes, in virtually every instance, are left with nothing.
Yeah, Skylar's question was about the criminal justice system today. Actually, that presages a question I also had, which, even though your books are very different, you both deal with issues of crime and punishment. In fact, in Madhouse at the End of the Earth, you actually start in Leavenworth Prison. And it made me as a reader really wonder, oh my God, how did this person end up there? So it was a great tool that you used there. And likewise, just your whole book, of course, is about the system of the very different views of the system of justice. And we find Governor Keith at the end also basically in prison back in London. So perhaps you could both comment a little bit about that aspect of your work. You want to start, Nicole?
Sure, yeah. So this whole book hinges on the question of what's going to happen to the Cartledge brothers. It's pretty clear from the beginning that they did commit the murder, but how is it going to be adjudicated? What's going to happen? And they were in and out of prison, and Governor Keith is actually conniving with John Cartledge, the older brother, at one point to try to get land that they think there are minerals on. So he springs him from prison, partially so he can show them where there might be some mining lands. So there's a lot of intrigue, and it really does have this kind of almost novelistic quality when you're reading the primary sources. Keith, as I mentioned, was always in debt. And the whole time he's hanging prison over the head of the Cartledge brothers, and in fact, over the course of this summer, executes a number of other people who get mentioned in the book, all of them very low-ranking people in society. It's unequal justice for sure, but in a turnabout that felt novelistic to me. By the end of his life, Keith had been taken back to debtor's prison. So after kind of flirting with carceral plans for everyone around him for most of the book, he himself actually does end his life in prison.
Thank you. My book deals, I guess, more tangentially with issues of criminality and justice, but it does begin there. The book begins with Cook as most people who remember Cook would know him, which is as a criminal, as a punchline, he was to detail his crime. He was trying to make money off of the Texas oil boom at the time, and ran a kind of I guess it would be a Ponzi scheme. He was trying to sell shares in a collection of defunct oil concerns, and would pay the dividends from those shares by selling more shares. So, and then also he was convicted technically of mail fraud because he was trumpeting the promises of these, promising that anybody who would invest in this they would make millions off of the land, because these oil rigs derricks were soon going to almost inevitably find gushers. And so he was just very florid language, promising Rockefeller-like wealth. And it turns out there was nothing there. They produced next to nothing. So he was convicted, but of probably 3 times longer his sentence was than anybody who had the other wildcatters who had made similar who had undertaken similar ploys, and that was in proportion to his notoriety because of the fact that he had famously lied about reaching the North Pole. So I guess my book takes a very empathetic view towards Cook, trying to redeem his legacy, because a man isn't just what he did at the end of his life. He isn't his own. He also isn't the worst thing he's ever done in his life. Here aboard the Belgica, he was a legitimate hero, and those very con man-like tendencies were of his criminally vivid imagination. Also was responsible for coming up with ingenious interventions to fight the cold and the dark, to fight, the men were suffering from scurvy, from they were growing literally insane in an epic case of cabin fever, their whole physiology was changing due to the dark and the cold. They were becoming depressed, what we now know as seasonal affective disorder. Was felt much more strongly here when the sun didn't rise for 3 months or 4 months, and it is now known as polar T3 syndrome, which is a hormonal imbalance. Cook didn't know anything about vitamin C. The vitamins hadn't really been discovered yet. He certainly didn't know that the physiological explanation for the effect of darkness on mental health. But he did intuit these things, and he just made up or invented from whole cloth a number of treatments, forcing the men to eat penguin. Because he realized that the canned food, whatever was in there, was just not doing it for them, and was not, and the bottled lime juice, despite what had been thought about lime's ability to combat scurvy, the bottled lime juice had lost all of its vitality by being concentrated. So he improvised. He was a great improviser, and what he was inspired by his time among the indigenous people of Greenland. He had been an Arctic explorer before going to the Antarctic. By the way, he's the first American to cross both polar circles. And he realized that even though the Inuit of Greenland did not have a very balanced diet, did not have not eat almost any vegetables throughout the winter, they didn't suffer from scurvy, and so all they ate was their freshly killed meat, and usually barely cooked seared, if that. And that led to all sorts of other health problems, but it prevented the onset of scurvy. So he assumed what was good for the Arctic would have been good for the only denizens of the Antarctic at that time, which was him and his men. And he forced them to eat fresh penguin and seal, to the great disgust of his men, and many, thinking this unfit for a Belgian to eat such uncivilized food, refused the treatment and ended up slipping down the scorbutic slope. And the other thing he did was to fight the effect of darkness. He realized he couldn't bring the sun to the Belgica, or rather the Belgica to the sun. So he brought the sun to the Belgica in some form by having the men stand in front of a blazing fire. And he figured this was also something that was inspired by his, what I would say, misinterpretation of Inuit lore. He thought that, simplistically, that the Inuit thought that light represented the spirit, and that the body could capture light. He was a very poor linguist. He didn't really understand anything about the Inuit, but even though he had many conversations and many Inuit friends, he didn't know what they were talking about. But it did lead, his understanding of what they were saying did lead to these pretty ingenious idea that light could combat depression, and which is now, this is known as the first, it's the first known instance of what we now call light therapy or phototherapy. And it did seem to have a beneficial effect on the men. I strayed very far from the social justice question, the justice question, but it did. It does show that, in my mind, that he shouldn't just be remembered as a convict. He should be remembered that those are two sides of the same coin. And as for his victims, they were not compensated of his scheme. Because he declared bankruptcy. He had nothing left after all of his schemes. He had reinvested his own fortune into his own Ponzi scheme. So there you go. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that's great. Any other question from the audience? Yes.
I don't know a lot about the Haudenosaunee, but I know that they had a more advanced sort of structure how to work together amongst the different nations. So how much, Nicole, did your books are dependent on that? How much do you get into it?
The question was how deeply Nicole's book gets into the Haudenosaunee system of government, basically.
So the crime occurred in the Susquehanna River Valley in a community called Conestoga. That was actually a fascinating multi-ethnic community and not really a Haudenosaunee center per se. It was what the historian Robbie Etheridge calls a shatter zone because of land dispossession, warfare, captive taking, slaving, disease. Native nations are really starting to come under severe pressure by the early 1700s, and many different Native peoples gathered together in Conestoga. So we have the Shawnee, which is an Algonquin group. And I mentioned the murdered man's wife's name, Winnie P. Wada. She was a member of the Shawnee, but there's a whole Shawnee leadership structure there. There are members of the Lenape there. Then there are various Iroquoian peoples, some of them incorporated as members of the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, like Sawantini, who was Seneca, or the diplomat Sachichoa, who was Cayuga. But the man we've been talking about, Taquataran Sali, or Captain Civility, he was Susquehannock, which was an Iroquoian group, but not formally part of the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee. The Five Nations come into play at kind of the climax because the ultimate treaty that was signed to end this conflict was signed as a multilateral treaty at a conference called by the leaders of the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee. So at the end of the book, I do talk about how the Five Nations would have come together to coordinate a kind of a unified response to this crisis and to speak with one voice at the final conference. And I should mention that treaty tells the story of the murder and of the outcome of the case, which in fact was that the Cartledges were released from jail and left to resume their lives. Now, there's a poignant twist that I won't give away, but that was the outcome of the treaty, and that treaty still remains in effect. It's actually the oldest continuously recognized treaty in Anglo-American law. And this is the 300th anniversary. It was signed in 1722. And I like to kind of point that out to say this is a part of our collective heritage, this tradition of justice that says, yeah, you're not the person you are on your very worst day. You could be reintegrated as a productive member of the community if the right rituals of restitution and repair are first gone through. To get back to that other man's question, I don't know if he's still here somewhere.
I mean, it was on the so. That's a really good segue to what I think might be our final question, which is really, the standard. What do you feel the relevance of your work is today? I know Nicole, in particular. Is it okay if I tell people the last line of the work? Nicole writes, "After centuries covered with night, we may yet hope for a new dawn." And it really hits you hard when you get to that final line because there's so many revelations that occur in the work. And also with you, Julian, I know you visited Antarctica, and you talk about how Antarctica contains about 80% of the world's freshwater reserves. And you've written about what you've learned in the press. But also I wonder, after having delved so deeply into the psychology of your protagonist, your main protagonist, what you think of some of these other sort of potentially reckless messianic figures like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos and their kind of endeavors in relationship to that. And again, how you feel about how your works can influence things we need to change about our society today. Who wants to go first? We'll let Julian go first.
Yeah, the examples of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are I guess, the closest parallels to Dujralash, not in the sense that they were in this, not in terms of their wealth, but in terms of their, I guess, insane ambition to push back the boundaries of human exploration. Insane, and I say that in an admiring way. I'm not admiring of everything about them, but the idea that they would want to reach Mars, sure, that's very similar to Dujralash's dream of reaching Antarctica, and not that they necessarily would be the first ones there, but anyway, what I think is an example worth learning from Dujralash and worth heeding for these, I guess, hubristic billionaires, is this idea that Dujralash was not after conquest so much. He broke with the precedent of other Arctic and Antarctic explorers by refusing to claim any land. This was a purely scientific endeavor. And not only that, but I think what's most admirable about Dujralash's the Belgic expedition is that it was an international one. It was international by default because people just didn't trust his. Not enough Belgian scientists trusted his project. He was able to, so he put together a scientific team composed mostly of Eastern Europeans, and Belgium was not a great seafaring nation. There was only 40 miles of coastline. The Dutch were the great seafaring power, and after their secession, the Belgians just had very few sailors worth their salt, and what few adventurers they could find would probably want to seek their fortune in the Congo. So the ones he was able, Dujralash had to supplement the Belgians with the Norwegian sailors who were much more adapted to the cold and to the briny Viking myths, having that in their blood, made them very well suited to Antarctic exploration. But so it might have been by default, but with that and the American doctor Frederick Cook, who came at the last second, but it ended up being international, and that led to, I believe, it was the first great international scientific expedition of the modern age, or at least one of the first, and it led very directly, I believe, to what became one of the great experiments in great success stories in geopolitics, which is the fact that Antarctica has been set aside since 1959. One of the signatories was de Gerlache's own son, Gaston de Gerlache, also an Antarctic explorer. Antarctica has been set aside, an entire continent. Just imagine how unlikely and inspiring this is. Been set aside for peaceful scientific cooperation among nations that would otherwise be in conflict. And for the last, I guess that would be 60 some odd years, and the treaty lasts until 2043, 2048. So it is remarkable that a continent so rich potentially in resources, that so important from a strategic point of view, has not been conquered. And I think that is directly I make the argument in the last few sections of the book that this is a direct result of de Gerlache's example, and that Antarctica has in turn been a model for international cooperation in space. And so not only does NASA, for example, study the example of the Belgica among other expeditions to design what such an expedition would look like and what to feed the astronauts and how to maintain their psychological stability and mental health, but the International Space Station, directly modeled after Antarctica. Unfortunately, you have Russia now backing out of the International Space Station, and now there's competing Chinese interests in space. And so I would very much, if Elon's in the crowd, I don't know if he's here, I would very much encourage Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and what other countries or individuals have aspirations to do as Gerlache did and blaze a new trail and reach Mars, to study his example, that cooperation is the only way we're going to get anywhere. We're not going to want to land on Mars and start a new war.
Thank you. I hope that there are lessons from the past for the future. In the 18th century, philosophers believed in a stage theory of civilizations, that some civilizations were more advanced than others and they could be kind of ordered and ranked, and Europeans were pretty sure of where they belonged in that stage theory. They really thought of themselves as the ultimate stage. And what I try to do in the book, in kind of building out the world of the colonists and the indigenous people, is just to give you a chance to think about, well, what was the context of the system of justice that we essentially have inherited with only minor modifications from the 18th century? This was a system of justice that arose in an atmosphere where people were auctioning toddlers on the block outside the courthouse, offering them for sale for profit. This was an atmosphere in which native land was being taken without any recompense. Where are the lines of civilization, actually? And what kind of world do we want to build today? There are many movements for criminal justice reform. And of course, people of color, indigenous people, have been disproportionately affected by mass incarceration in the United States, which remains a terrible problem and scourge. I'm trying to suggest that this is everyone's problem. That we have all inherited this very dubious Enlightenment legacy, and that there are other legacies that have been bequeathed to us, but we have to claim them. And I hope this book could be a step in that direction. Thanks.
Well, thank you both so much, Julian Sancton, Nicole Eustace. They will be signing their books, and I really do encourage you to read them both. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you.